Demands for urgent action to curb man-made global warming, that is, climate change, arise almost entirely from the world's wealthiest countries, countries that built their wealth using the abundant, affordable, reliable energy available from fossil fuels. Now they demand a rapid, forced transition from fossil fuels to wind and solar to reduce global warming. Now, aside from the fact that, first of all, fossil fuels' contribution to warming is probably quite small and benign, and second, the energy gained from them is crucial to all economic production, whether of food, clothing, shelter, transportation, healthcare, education, or anything else. And third, the fertilization effect of the CO2 emitted into the atmosphere when we use them benefits all plant life on the earth and thus makes food more affordable for everyone. Aside from those three things, well, this demand neglects the fact that poverty brings far more risks than climate change. And the world's poor nations will benefit far more from overcoming poverty than from anything we might do to reduce global warming. Tonight, Vijay Jayaraj, an independent climate researcher from India and Cornwall Alliance contributor for developing countries, joins us to discuss these and related issues in a two-part series on From the Stacks. This is the second of those two parts, and we're glad to have Vijay with us. Before we move to Vijay, though, let me just tell you a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance. We are a network of just under 70 scholars, roughly a third scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists, roughly a third economists, particularly those specializing in environment and development, and roughly a third theologians, philosophers, and ethicists, all dedicated to educating the public and policymakers on three things together and interwoven with each other. Biblical earth stewardship, that is how we can fulfill the dominion mandate of Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth, a dominion that should reflect God's own dominion, in which he brings order out of chaos, life out of non-life, and great variety of life. Our dominion should be one in which we enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors. And then, in addition, economic development for the very poor through a combination of private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law. All of these tied together to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the biblical worldview and theology and ethics that come with that, by which men can be reconciled to God. Sinners like me can be forgiven of our sins and proclaimed righteous in God's sight by God's grace through the faith that he gives us in our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. These are the priorities of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and we are committed to spreading that good news around the world. Every month, we offer a special educational resource to anyone who will donate even the smallest amount. That is as our way of saying thanks. When you give a 100% tax-deductible donation, no matter how small the size, we're glad to send you this new educational resource. This month, it is a study called Not in Our Backyard. Rural Americans are fighting back against large-scale renewable energy projects. This is by my friend Robert Bryce, author of a large number of really outstanding books on the physics, the engineering, the economics of energy around the world. And I'm delighted to be able to offer this study this month. To request yours, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, write in promo code 21-08 or simply the title, Not in Our Backyard, and we will be glad to send it to you free of charge. Thanks very much for tuning in tonight. We hope that you will enjoy our discussion with Vijay Jayaraj. Vijay, thanks for joining us again. This has been quite a deal for you in that because of the time zone difference, you had to be up all night long to do this program
Yeah,
with us. I so much
yeah,
appreciate you doing that.
great. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be on the podcast or the video cast, and yeah, that's it's always a joy to discuss on these matters.
Well, thank you. Last week, we discussed, I believe it was 4 different articles that you had written over the last couple of months that were published in various different places: American Thinker and the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the Cornwall Alliance's own website, I think townhall.com. You get published all over the place, all over the world. It's rather exciting to see that happening with you. Um, this evening, we're going to discuss a few more recent articles that you've done. Uh, our basic thrust for both last week and this evening has been to ask the question: who speaks for the poor in developing countries when it comes to climate change and climate and energy policy? And we wanted you to be able to sound off on this because you're not only a climate scientist, but you're also a citizen of India. You live there, you've made most of your life there, and you're familiar with life both in the developed world, where you did your studies in climate science in England and then in Canada, but also with life in the developing world. You've seen poverty, you've lived poverty, and you know that that is a far greater risk than anything related to climate. Can you, before we jump into your first article tonight, can you just address that basic issue? Why is it that overcoming poverty is so much more important to people in the developing world than fighting global warming?
Yeah, I think the state of poverty in the developing parts of the world is very severe. Uh, if I can remember one quote from uh, an analyst in Africa, he said that those who recommend climate action in the developing parts of the world and in the poor countries are those who have never sat through abject poverty, went uh, hungry in the night, sat in dark, powerless houses. And he was right when he said that, because the Western civilization has gone through the industrial era and is now reaping the benefits of the industrial era, which was fueled by fossil fuels. So, and they do not know what it means to be in abject poverty, unless, of course, those individuals who traveled and lived and experienced this poverty. Apart from that, it's quite, uh, even then, you wouldn't get the full essence of living in poverty, where you do not have a way out, like you are literally in that state forever. So that is the state of poverty in the developing parts of the world. In Brazil, for example, more than 12% of its population is under the poverty line. In India, uh, around 200 million of people live in poverty. That's like literally two-thirds of the population of US. So we are talking about less than $1.50 a day, and that means that you do not have electrical appliances, you cannot afford nutritious food, you cannot give your children a good education, and so on. Uh, so for people like these in developing parts of the world, uh, the the notion that they have to sacrifice fossil fuels, and they have to sacrifice, say, a bus ride or a ride on their motor cycle, uh, just for the sake of saving the planet from climate change, is something that they could not relate with, uh, because one, climate the impact of climate change is not felt near them, except for the urban heat island effect. That is something where, because of the built infrastructure within urban regions, you have heat building up within those urban pockets, which is not natural heat, and it causes an increase in both day and nighttime temperatures. So they feel that, but they do not feel any danger to their life, because crops don't get affected, at least in countries like India and China, which are producing record harvest year after year. Uh, that is not impacted by climate change. Uh, they can survive through heat waves if they take a few measures where they can adapt themselves to the heat wave. They'll be safe. So that is not an issue. So for them, uh, to forgo some of their basic essential rights uh, for the sake of climate is like something unprecedented, and they cannot relate to that. Some of the things that are taken for granted in the Western society is still a luxury in places like India, Africa, where uninterrupted power supply is unheard of. Like, I live in a big city in India, and I faced power blackouts like every day of the week for the past few months, in fact. So, so for us, when I mean for us, for people in developing countries, it's strange to forgo their life ambitions for the sake of climate change. Yeah, so that would be
Yeah,
the shortest way you can put it. Yeah.
yeah. I like to put it to people, look, the risks from poverty are far greater than the risks from anything related to climate and climate change. I mean, if you have income equivalent to, say, the bottom tenth of Americans, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. If you're living on the equivalent of about $2 a day, you can't thrive anywhere, even in the greatest, you know, tropical island, paradise like island. Health and long life depend heavily on significant income, and that income is made possible by a combination of very, very productive farming, making food available for lots of people without having it be grown by lots of people, and productive industry, making food, clothing, shelter, transportation, communication, healthcare, and all these other things on which our lives depend and our health depends. These things are really crucial to human well-being, and those things absolutely depend on access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And roughly 85% of all the energy consumed in the world every year right now comes from fossil fuels. And that's because they're very high density fuel sources, energy sources. Uh, Energy density and power density, the amount of energy in a given unit of the source, whether it's a lump of coal or a second of wind blowing on a turbine blade, that's energy density. Power density is the rate of flow of energy that you can bring from the source. Fossil fuels are very high density on those things, whereas wind and solar are very, very low density. Fossil fuels, because we can stockpile them and then put them into generating plants and burn them when we want to, those are extremely reliable. They're not intermittent, they are constant. Whereas wind and solar are very intermittent and unreliable. And so, consequently, energy from fossil fuels is much less expensive than energy from wind and solar. And if people need lots of energy to rise and stay out of poverty, we should want for it to be inexpensive. So, as I see it, Vijay, you and others in the developing world have every right to insist that you be able to use the same things that lifted the Western world out of poverty in your own efforts to conquer poverty in those lands. Well, right now, I'd like us to turn to looking at one such country, and that is the country of Brazil. Brazil is a country in which the roughly 12% of the people live beneath the poverty line, which is the equivalent of about $1.66 in US dollars per person per day in income. And so Brazil is not one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's not quite one of the poorest either, but it's certainly well below, say, middle of the line for wealth. On March 5, 2021, Vijay, the Guardian's editorial team made a scathing attack on Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro in an article titled "The Guardian View on Jair Bolsonaro: A Danger to Brazil and the World." And that, as you pointed out in your article, Brazil's use of natural resources is right, despite media's attacks on Bolsonaro, is the latest of a string of attacks that the mainstream media have carried out on Bolsonaro ever since he became president. The MSM, the mainstream media, and radical environmentalists have often criticized and even ostracized Bolsonaro. In the past, many of these criticisms were aimed at his policy decisions on natural resource use. The Guardian in 2021 called Biden's negotiations with Bolsonaro negotiating with your worst enemy, justifying their hatred based on a concoction of pseudo-scientific claims on climate change and radical green ethics. They even called for the removal of Bolsonaro from office. His departure, in their perspective, would be, quote, good for the planet. But you ask in your article, is Bolsonaro's strategy to prioritize natural resource use, especially fossil fuels, really bad for Brazil? Tell us, Vijay, is it?
Well, it's not. The media attack on the Brazilian president has been quite astonishing. It's more like they are obsessed with criticizing him for mainly because he does not play along with their climate fear tactics, and he believes in using the right kind of fuel, in his case fossil fuels, for providing the necessary energy output required for powering industries, commercial establishment, and households, and making them produce at an affordable rate so that the poor can climb up the socioeconomic ladder. So the ideas that he has are good, but however, he has been under heavy attack from the media, and it's understandable because the media does a lot of mistake when it comes to Brazil. For instance, they claimed Amazon is the the lungs of the earth. This was, I believe, 2 years back, and it was quickly debunked, even from a scientist or a researcher of their own. Uh, it need not. It didn't have to be proven wrong by someone else. Someone very close to the person who made this claim debunked it. So yeah, but if you look at Brazil, you cannot s- right away think about the Amazon. Yes, Amazon is important, and a very good strategic way of conserving it is required. But under no circumstance that the Brazilian government should be ordered to not use the resources at all. And especially when it comes to coal, the country has a good amount of coal reserves, which can be utilized for electricity. And that is crucial because if you see, more than 12% of Brazilians are under poverty, and the pandemic did not help at all. In 2020, a lot of people in urban areas like Rio fell back into the poverty line, and the government actually gave out a lot of money. In the second half of 2020, the pandemic year, the government support helped a lot of people, but then the support ended last December. So that is only a short-term measure which will not address the poverty issue in Brazil. What Brazil needs is a long-term strategy, a strategy very akin, similar to the ones that we saw in the industrial America and industrial Europe, where a strong energy sector founded on fossil fuels propel the economy by uh, uh, energizing its industries is the way out for Brazil as well. There are no shortcuts. So that is what Brazil must be focused on. And I think they were quite vocal about this issue in the recent months, and they made sure that they will continue to invest in technologies that enable an acceleration of fossil fuel use. And this can also be seen in their keen interest in developing offshore oil fields to increase their oil consumption, and billions of dollars have has been invested in the recent 2 years. So the government has a good understanding of what's needed for the country, but it's under heavy attack from the mainstream media. And it would be interesting to see if the current administration in Brazil changes, what would be the approach of the government there. What Brazil cannot afford is to soften its stance on fossil fuels for the sake of what the media is trying to do. So that is something people would be interested in finding out for themselves. It's good to understand the linkage between poverty and the energy sector. When you have a good energy sector, it propels the GDP, and it's a very well established fact. And so Brazil needs to stay clear of the climate drama in the years ahead.
Okay, so that's Brazil, and Brazil is one of the countries that is bucking the demand from the wealthy countries of the world that the world turn away from fossil fuels. Brazil is certainly not doing that, and I think it has every right to pursue its own economic development through the wise use of fossil fuels. Now, another of your articles treats a different country, a very different country. Brazil, of course, is one of the largest countries in the world, one of the most populous countries in the world as well, and it's a continental country. Japan is, in terms of land area, one of the smallest countries in the world, also one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Brazil is among the poorer, Japan is among the more wealthy countries in the world. And you've written an article, Japan's new anti-fossil fuel approach will compromise its energy security, which ran in townhall.com recently. And there you point out that Japan's kind of going the opposite direction, or at least it's making noises of going in the opposite direction. And you suggest that that's not going to be a great thing for Japan. You point out that, or you mention that you worked on a Japanese funded railway corridor project in India that would likely support both electric and diesel trains. But Japan is now moving away from fossil fuels and reducing its dependency on coal and oil for energy. Then you ask, is Japan committing a major blunder with its energy policy? Why is it dangerous to its economy and that of others in Asia? So address those two questions for us. Is Japan making a big mistake? And why is it dangerous?
Yeah, my first insight into who Japan is began when I was a young environmentalist in India, and I worked on a project that involved environmental impact assessment of a new freight corridor, a train corridor in the western part of India. So it was funded by the Japanese government, and that is when I realized that that Japan is a key country in Asia, uh, not just with who they are, but what they are doing with other Asian countries, and the amount of investments and funding that they have done in Asia to develop projects like the one that I worked on, and many other projects, and their active role in the Asian Development Bank. And so that was my introduction to Japan. And to see Japan shift completely in the past 2 years, it's quite shocking. The new Prime Minister, PM Suga, uh, apologies if I pronounce his name wrongly, but he has been quite uh, uh, vocal in saying that Japan will move away from fossil fuels. So, beginning in 2020, the government started announcing that they are not gonna build new coal power plants, and they are more importantly, they are not gonna fund any coal projects in Asia. I mean, across the globe. So that is a big blow to countries like India and others. Like, of course, even if India doesn't take, there are other highly populated and rapidly developing countries in Southeast Asia, where Japanese money has helped a lot in the commissioning and the functioning of coal power plants. So what happened is that as soon as the Japanese government announced that they are not going to participate and they are going to stop the investments, this was followed by the big corporations, energy corporations in Japan, uh, which also raised their hands and said they are also going to pull out from whatever projects that they are doing, and they are also going to stop investing in Southeast Asia. So, beginning in the late 2020 until last month, we saw a huge exodus of Japanese energy corporations refusing to pursue their proposed fossil fuel plans in countries like Vietnam, uh, and other Southeast Asian countries. So not only has Japan stopped as a nation in investing, but also it has made all its energy corporations from investing in other countries. So besides that, it's also important to understand that Japan is a huge power consuming country. It's the third largest consumer of oil in the world, and it's the fifth largest consumer of oil, I guess, and it's the third largest importer of coal. To understand why Japan, such an advanced country, consumes such a significant proportion of fossil fuels, we must understand its history. So, Japan, until the Fukushima nuclear incident happened in 2011, Japan was predominantly coal and nuclear. But when nuclear reliance on nuclear stopped in 2011, their dependency on coal increased further. So by 2017, their coal dependency reached its peak. But since then, they've tried to add more and more renewables to their energy mix. Unfortunately, as you talked about it earlier, renewables cannot afford or renewables cannot produce an output that can sustain the energy needs in Japanese cities. So, what
Now,
Japan has
Vijay, if I
literally,
can interrupt for a
yeah,
moment, while we were off the air, you told our producer Jim Moline and me an interesting thing about one particular thing in Japan that depends on electricity in its airports and other public places that would be really in serious trouble in case become thoroughly dependent on wind. At when the blowing, the sun's not shining. Tell us in someone.
yeah, so I had this interesting experience in Tokyo's Narita airport when I visited 5 years back. So I wanted to use the washroom, and to my surprise, it was a fully electronic washroom. So right from the door to the commode, and everything was electronic. So given that Japanese government is shifting towards renewables, I began to wonder how many of these kind of washrooms are there in Japan, and what if there is no wind, and what if there is no sun? How would they get their power from? And well, people can say, well, there can be batteries, but how batteries? We are talking about a highly technological city, and this is just one example. Almost everything there is depends on electricity. And even Bill Gates, who's an ardent promoter of renewables, said that it's impossible to power a Japanese city like Tokyo with a huge proportion of renewables in the energy mix. So,
Yeah,
so it's quite funny, like what would happen, like if you want to use the washroom, like that was just a trivial thought. Yeah,
yeah, right. Now, even as recently as 2019, Japan was getting a large percent, roughly 70% of its electricity generation from fossil fuels. You have a
yeah,
graph about that in your article.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
just talk about how difficult is it going to be for Japan to bring that percentage down by replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar?
Yeah, like 87 percentage of all energy consumed in Japan comes from coal, natural gas, and petroleum. So if you want to replace a majority of that with renewables, then you are in for a big mess. Like there will be power blackouts, and if power blackouts happens in Japan, we have to translate the impact at household level, at the commercial level, at an industrial scale, how the impact would be in a automated country like Japan, which depends on technology for everything. So, for example, I like we even have the house cleaning robot, that's the Japanese tech available now in India. So, and it's very common in Japan. So, it's the country is altogether different, and it would be surprising to see how uh, their cities would survive when the country tries to introduce less reliable and more expensive renewables into the mix. And it will be devastating, to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's turn to another of your recent articles, Vijay. This one is titled Vietnam at Energy Crossroads. Will it choose the best way forward? One of the things that I really appreciate about you, Vijay, is that you have been studying carefully the energy situations and the economic situations in countries all over the world. You look carefully at what would be the consequences of a change in energy policy toward more renewables, more wind and solar for countries all over Asia, Africa, Latin America. Now, we've just been talking about Japan, which is one of the wealthier countries in the world. A much poorer country is Vietnam. And Vijay, you recently wrote an article called Vietnam at Energy Crossroads. Will it choose the best way forward? Again, this is one of those situations where I think Americans tend to not look terribly much at what's happening in a lot of the world outside our own country. And yet, you very carefully study what's happening in developing countries, especially all over the world. When many of us hear the name Vietnam, of course, we think immediately of its infamous place in history as a war zone. But we're now 4 decades past that, and Vietnam is just another developing country in Southeast Asia, and it's struggling to devise better working conditions, better economic strategies to eradicate poverty. Now, Vietnam was poised to be one of the strongest coal markets in Asia. Some would argue that it still is. But a recent commitment to climate policies threatens to squeeze the life out of its growing economy. as coal is the most affordable and dependable energy source, but Vietnam is being pressured to end its use of coal. Vijay, tell us what's going on in Vietnam. Tell us where the pressure is coming from. Tell us, tell us how you think the Vietnamese leaders should respond to this and why.
Yeah, so Vietnam is registering a rapid growth economically. Uh, they are forecasted to be the fastest growing GDP in Asia in 2021. And that is because they have had a very strong energy sector, which is founded on fossil fuels, of course. And so many people do not understand this, but fossil fuels have been testament to the growth in Vietnam, and they are performing much better than other Southeast Asian countries. And when you look at their coal consumption and the demand for electricity and the GDP growth over the past 10 years, they all correlate with each other. In other words, a steady increase in coal supply propelled the economy in a very rapid manner. And experts predict that this will continue for the next decade, where their electricity demand will increase, and their energy demand will increase by 10% each year. So that's a lot. That's a rapid rate of increase in electricity demand, and I believe they cannot sustain and meet such a demand without their continued reliance on coal. But things have changed since the Paris Agreement, and there has been a lot of pressure applied on Vietnam in the recent years, and this led to the government issuing statements in 2020 and 21 that they are looking to reduce their dependency on coal. Nevertheless, the country will continue to depend and increase its reliance on coal until 2030. But what the government does beyond that, we have to wait and see. So far, the government in Vietnam seems to be going away from coal. They are giving into the pressure from the West. So that is not good news for the country's economy, because renewables cannot fulfill the country's demand in the way coal and oil does. In fact, the country receives majority of its electricity and the primary energy from fossil fuels, just like any other major Southeast Asian country. So to imagine that those energy resources have to be replaced with renewables is unthinkable. And so although the country has made statements on coal dependency, on the flip side, it seems to be increasing its investment and reliance on oil. So the country has tweaked its laws so as to encourage the oil refineries and uh, the oil companies to operate with much more freedom in their country. And the government has invested a lot of money into developing offshore oil wells, and it has allowed foreign direct investments, and a lot of big oil companies are taking interest in the development of oil in Vietnam. So these are the developments in Vietnam. Uh, it looks like the country is torn between using more coal to meet its forecasted demand during the next 10 years. And without no doubt, the country will be among the top three GDP performing countries in Southeast Asia during next 3 years, in the next 3 years. So the government must decide soon in which way it's going to tilt, because if they are going to give in to the pressure, then it would be a big blow to its industries. Even energy analysts within the country suggest the same. So yeah, we have to wait and see what the government does there.
Yeah, I think people can get a good sense of just what a huge challenge it would be for Vietnam to move decisively into renewables if they get a good look at the current mix of energy sources for electricity in Vietnam. There, as you point out, and you have this graph to illustrate, 53% of all electricity in the year 2020 in Vietnam came from coal, another 26% from hydroelectric power stations, but those aren't very dependable when there are drought years. And then 21% came from oil, gas, and non hydro renewables. So now those non-hydro renewables basically are wind and solar and biofuels and geothermal and uh, even wood and things like that. Uh, Altogether, they make up a pretty tiny percentage of Vietnam's electric generation capacity. So, in order to have a huge shift, you would have to have an enormous reduction in the use of coal, natural gas, and oil. And that just doesn't seem to be in the offing for Vietnam. I mean, how can they do that? Do they have the technical and the financial resources to make such a switch?
The answer is no. And it's not just Vietnam. Any rapidly developing country in the third world cannot make such a huge shift. And at least not without a cost of a high frequency of power interruption. We are talking about more than 12 hours a day. Uh, Without such a nature of power interruption, the country cannot replace fossil fuels with renewables. And even if they do, it will take them at least 2 decades, and it will be a huge blow all the way. Like right from the moment they begin to transition to renewables, it would be chaotic. So I would encourage our listeners to just look at the energy mix for each country. It's available on a lot of websites, and you can go country wise. You can see it's impossible when people talk about shifting from fossil fuels to renewables. Renewables simply cannot match the amount of electricity output that fossil fuels are currently generating in some of the most rapidly developing economies across the globe.
Okay, really good. Thank you very much, Vijay. We have one more article of yours to go over, and that's one that looks at sort of what's behind all these international demands for this shift from fossil fuels, which are abundant, affordable, and reliable, to renewables, wind and solar especially, which are diffuse, expensive, and unreliable. And that's an article that you wrote called Wolves in Sheep's Clothing: Energy Facilitators Turn into Energy Inhibitors. Before we step into that article, I do want to remind our audience one more time that during the month of August, as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible gift of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance, we would be glad to send you a free copy of this new study called Not in Our Backyard: Rural America is Fighting Back Against Large Scale Renewable Energy Projects. This is by Robert Bryce, one of the best writers on energy and engineering, energy physics, energy science, energy economics in the world, and one of my heroes in that field of scholarship. Uh, to request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and then as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, write in promo code 21-08. That's promo code 21-08, or the title, Not in Our Backyard, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy of that wonderful new resource. It's an educational tool that you can share with your neighbors, that I would encourage you to pass on to teachers in local schools, especially public schools, They won't get this perspective from many other places, but it's a good one to have. All right, so now, Vijay, our last article to discuss this evening was Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, Energy Facilitators Turn into Energy Inhibitors. You began this by writing, global energy organizations originally formed to aid and help countries to better utilize and access energy resources are now doing the opposite. One such organization, the International Energy Agency, has become a wolf in sheep's clothing. It advocates against fossil fuels instead of promoting their use as the abundant, affordable, reliable energy sources they are. Just a little quick background for our viewers on the International Energy Agency. The IEA was formed back in the 1970s during the Arab oil embargo that deprived Western industrialized nations of a steady, reliable supply of oil from mostly Middle Eastern countries. And so the G7, or I'm sorry, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, back in 1974, formed the International Energy Agency for the purpose of ensuring a steady, consistent, reliable flow of oil around the world in global trade. That was the IEA's stated initial purpose. That was its charter. But now we find the IEA arguing against the use of oil, against the use of other fossil fuels, and trying to push toward what they're calling net zero by 2050. That is, achieving net zero emissions of carbon dioxide from the US economy and economies all over the world, especially in developed countries. The idea is that emissions of carbon dioxide would be either completely eliminated or offset 100% by various things that would suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This is the idea, and recently the IEA put forth a report called Net Zero by 2050, in which it recommends an unprecedented transition to renewable sources of energy. Um, Tell us about this. What's wrong with this? And how should Americans in particular be responding to this, since the Biden administration has embraced it with gusto?
Yeah, so the International Energy Agency, in short form IEA, was supposed to facilitate the use of natural resources, including oil, especially oil. But today, they are against oil, they are against coal, they are even against natural gas, and they are recommending for countries to make a rapid and urgent transition to renewables, and their reason is that it will help avoid a dangerous warming and climate change. So but what has happened is, the very organization, which is a big name in energy circles, and they are quite authoritative when it comes to dissemination of energy statistics, has now which was supposed to facilitate it, has turned into an inhibitor of reliable uh, energy resources across the globe. So one of the reasons why the Americans or the people in the West should be wary of IEA is that it is just playing along the climate narrative. It has very uh, less uh, reasonable basis for recommending such a huge transition. For instance, they recommend that electric vehicles should constitute around 60% of the total vehicle share, even by 2030, if possible. That's their recommendation. But if you look at a sample model electric vehicle like Tesla, the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that happen just during the manufacturing stage of a Tesla car could sometimes be more than the carbon dioxide emissions that a normal combustion engine would emit in a couple of years. So these are statistics that the media doesn't want people to know. Like what they are proposing could even result in an increase in carbon dioxide emission. And not only that, more than 80% of the primary energy consumed in the world comes from fossil fuels, and oil and coal, and more recently natural gas play a very important part of it. So when you forgo the 80%, or let's say the 80% reduces to even 40%, the currently available technologies in renewables, wind, solar, biomass, and hydro, are incapable of meeting the 40% that you've taken away from fossils. So when that is the reality across the globe, you'll have a world that is which is in a greater disparity, where a very select few will have access to even the very basic necessities of life. And people in the West might think this is like something that is far off, that we might develop technologies to substitute, but that's the real world scenario doesn't say so. And one such example is the power blackout in Texas, uh, which had a over reliance on the renewables when it came to its grid electricity. And as a result, when the storm struck there recently, you had a power blackout. Likewise, in California, the renewable dominated system could not handle the extreme uh, natural disaster event that took place there. And likewise, you can go on and on with so many examples in recent years, where the renewable mix in the electricity grid has resulted to either blackouts or an increase in power, and eventually on the economy. It might not be visible in a developed country, but as the grid begins to transit to more and more renewable, that will become a reality. And for people in developing countries like us, it's a policy like a Green New Deal, which the IEA totally supports, is like a total nightmare. No way would a country like India or China embrace Green New Deal. And that is where I think the people in the West must be very careful. They should understand the metrics and see what are the solutions and policy changes being not just prescribed by organizations like IEA, but also being put into motion by the different governments in the West. So so in energy terms, it would result in uh, a very severe impact on even the most basic necessities of life, day-to-day life. And we are not talking about a scenario in 2030 or 40, but something that in near future, that we have already witnessed in some of the states. So that would be
Yes.
my advice to people. And sadly, we have organizations like IEA, which have made a complete U-turn and is now misleading energy advisors and governments into embracing a totally disastrous energy policy.
Thank you, Vijay. Yeah, the IEA, I think, has just done an inexplicable thing. Last week, we had on our live stream program Dr. David Kreutzer, an economist with the Institute for Energy Research, the and he talked about the IEA's report on net zero by 2050. And he pointed out that, quite simply, although the report cheerleads for this goal, if you actually look carefully at the data in it, at the magnitudes of the things being propounded, it makes it very, very clear that this simply is not going to happen. It cannot happen. It is not possible One of the biggest problems, of course, is the amount of land that has to be used for the wind turbines and solar panels. A Harvard study last August, a year ago from now, uh, addressed the question, how much land would we have to cover with wind farms? They're not really farms, of course. On farms, you grow you grow crops and animals. These are wind factories, really. How much land would you have to cover to get all of the electricity that the United States now uses just from wind factories, wind turbines around the country? Their answer was all the land from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. And then they asked the question, okay, now suppose that we add to our electric demand all of the energy necessary for our entire transportation sector, aside from airplanes. Nobody's talking about running airplanes on electricity, not certainly not passenger jets, cargo jets, uh, but cars, trucks, trains. And the answer to that was, in order to provide electricity for all of that transport sector, we would have to cover the rest of the land from the Mississippi to the Pacific with
Hmm.
wind turbines. Nobody seems to think about that, but that's the actual consequences of the very, very low density nature of wind and solar and of their intermittency. It's simply not going to happen. Well, Vijay, do you have some closing comments for us as someone in India familiar with the Western world, with the United States, with Canada, with Great Britain? Do you have some words for us as to where you want to see American citizens moving and what sorts of policies you want to see them support?
Yeah, I think the a lot of developing countries, especially the leaders, usually mimic or try to follow a success formula that is already in principle out there in the West. So, if the citizens in the developed parts of the world, like the US and the UK, stand up for their energy rights and demand that the government stop experimenting with unreliable renewables, then the other countries in the world might follow in their footsteps. But for that, the citizens, for example, in US, must contact their representatives and let them know what their position is, and besides that, they can also make sure that funding from organizations like the US aid, which funds a lot of developmental projects across the globe, are not used for totally unreliable wind and solar in developing countries, where those investments cannot be taken. They will not give any returns in developing countries, so it will be a waste of money. Uh, so the citizens in the West must make their voice known, but also stand up for policies, and make their governments choose wise energy policies, thereby pressurizing them when it comes to international diplomacy and their role in the whole green energy movement. That will have a ripple effect on other developing countries, ease the pressure over here in the developing countries, as leaders here will notice what's happening there. So we live in a world where things cannot happen uh, individually in different countries. Rather, our leaders have all chosen to be in a pact, and hence we are in some way or another connected, and what happens in some key country has a impact on a dozen developing countries. So I would encourage everybody to share the key information on the energy reality with friends and families, and if they are able to contact their political representatives, let them know what they think, and vote for policies that ensure good energy governance in their respective countries. Yeah, that's something that. But I also want to add that there's a key aspect about renewables. They don't just take up land; they take up land that is for key wildlife species,
Right,
especially
right.
birds. So yeah, so I worked on key habitats, conservation habitats for birds in Europe, and I also met people who worked with uh, uh, on bird conservation in India, and the message is the same. The renewables pose a great threat to wildlife habitats, and it's happen. And imagine if renewables need to occupy the entire landmass of the US just to power the households, industries, and the vehicles. Imagine the situation in developing countries where already there is less and less land. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
something that I want to leave the listeners with. Yeah.
All right. Well, Vijay Jayaraj, thank you very much for joining us again this evening. Friends, for the remainder of this month, we have some really, I think, exciting programs lined up for you. Next week on August 17, Dr. Will Happer, who is Emeritus Professor of Physics at Princeton, one of the world's top physicists, really, and for a long time, one of the leading research physicists with the U.S. government, is going to be our guest discussing uh, a testimony that he gave before the German Bundestag recently. That's sort of their equivalent of our Congress, and also a talk that he gave for the Irish Climate Science Forum. And so he will be with us for next week. 2 weeks from tonight, we have Robert Bryce discussing Not in Our Backyard, the promo that we are offering this month. That is a wonderful study on how rural America can stand against the encroachment of massive renewable energy projects, not in our backyard. Uh, During this month, we will be glad to send a free copy of this as our way of saying thanks when you make a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance and request it. So to receive your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, write in promo code 21-08. That's promo code 21-08, or the title, Not in Our Backyard. And we'll be glad to send you a free copy of this resource. And then finally, on the last Tuesday of this month, August 31, we are celebrating Cornwall Alliance's 16th birthday. We will have as guests on that program at least Dr. Roy Spencer, Dr. David Legates, and Vijay Jayaraj, along with Megan Kennard and me, celebrating our birthday. This is going to be a lot of fun. It'll be a time for some reminiscing. It'll be a time for sort of looking at what it is that the Cornwall Alliance has achieved over the last 16 years, and where are we going in the future. So I would encourage you to come and join us as we talk with Dr. Roy Spencer and Dr. David Legates, two outstanding climatologists, as well as Vijay Jayaraj, who has been our guest this evening throughout this program and was last week as well. So again, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you and having you see our guests in the coming weeks. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his face upon you and give you peace.